Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, we are back for the next Riga Conference 2020 discussion, and this is a really interesting one. The topic is pandemics reshape the global order. China and the United States. It seems that no country, no society, no individual is left outside of this challenge, and probably this year's Riga Conference is one of the examples. As we are debating, it's like the existing and future challenges with experts that are present, but from remote areas. So this pandemic has created some adjustments to the global order to which we have used over the years. It's like, but at this moment we have to live with distant proximities. It's like, and it is very interesting to see that online tools and communication tools are helping us to uphold our objectives and hold discussions like this. This time we are about to discuss the surge of the East or the West and the ostensible decline of the West. Fareed Zakaria was the one who started discussing and challenging this trend in the past in 2007. At the moment, it seems that the global pandemic COVID-19 has lit additional fire to this process and accelerated these trends. In China, there are pundits that think that this pandemic has unveiled the weakness of the United States, since United States is suffering domestic divisions and challenge to its democratic structures, especially during the 2020 election. And it seems that the United States is turning inwards and more caring about economic aspects and interests of the society. The United States is safe and affluent, and that is what its citizens is mostly caring of. Then there are different kind of alliances and the surge of the rest, especially China. And the overarching question is, to which direction will such American allies as Europe lean in these days? Will China embrace the role of the global leadership, and how many countries will be willing to follow China in these times? This is not the competition of the states or the short-term challenge like the pandemic that we are coping with, that we are facing at the moment. This is exactly the overarching question: what kind of global order are we foreseeing? Which values and which countries are ready to lead our societies, and what kind of alliances are major powers ready to propose for the international community? This is an online discussion, so I'll shortly remind you about the rules. We have a couple of prominent speakers. I'll give 5 to 7 minutes to each of them, and if there's a little cough on my side, it's not the COVID. It's like it is just a reminder for you to wrap up and conclude your initial remarks. After your remarks and statements, we will open for questions and answers. So I'll introduce each of the speakers separately. I'll give a word to each of the speaker following the first, second, and third, and then I will also open for the questions and answers. I'm really happy to see distinguished speakers, and the first one in my list is Dr. Kori Shake. She is Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Institute, and incidentally, she wrote a very interesting book that says, it's like, is the United States together with the West or not? And probably she has a lot to say just to set the background for this discussion. So, Kori, the floor is yours.
Good morning, my friends. It is 6:30 in the morning in California, so you can tell how much I actually wanted to have this conversation with you, that I am here. So I think the effects of COVID on the international order are overstated, but here's what I think they are. The United States has once again done damage to its reputation by how badly we have handled the pandemic. But it's actually not the first failure of American soft power. And I don't think it will have too enduring an effect, because, to be honest, I think most people understand that the country that put a man on the moon also is the country that managed the Iraq war badly, and we're capable of both good and bad things, doing things well and doing things poorly. But I do think there will be, and I think China has also managed the pandemic badly, both with its handling of the pandemic and the information early on, and in the way it's bullying other countries with dishonesty. So I don't think it changes the US-China dynamic, except it will remind people once again that information from coming out of China, whether economic statistics or health statistics, are unreliable. It's exciting to see the countries who have handled the pandemic so well. It's a delight to see Taiwan, South Korea, Germany setting excellent examples for the rest of us to follow. And the strength of the West has never just been the strength of the United States. It's been the emergence of good ideas and practices that the rest of us can emulate from all over the place. Because the real strength of the West is the ability of free societies to correct their mistakes, to have a strong, stable foundation that can react. Other things I think are going to be the result of the pandemic. I think it's going to be very hard for emerging markets to continue to emerge because of the economic consequences of the pandemic. I mean, the huge reduction in the global economy will, I think, hit particularly hard the economies that are exporters of natural resources. Also, I think it will increase income inequality both within states, which is always a challenge for free societies, but also among states, because countries that have permissive business environments and have innovative businesses will be much quicker to figure out how to capitalize on the new opportunities presented by the emergence of the pandemic. And so we'll sprint ahead of economies that don't have as adaptive of business environments. What else do I think will be big effects? I think, well, one big effect for China will, if emerging countries don't continue to emerge, the Belt and Road Initiative could become an enormous anchor dragging China's economy underwater. And since China has been an engine of the global economy, I think that will have significant effects. I mean, China's already the world's biggest creditor. And if the BRI projects, which were always suspicious as to their economic viability, become incapable of ever producing revenue, China's going to have a big decision to make, whether they want to be a generous creditor or whether they want to try and enforce the terms of existing contracts. So all in all, my sense is that it's likely to, in the near term, to have horrible individual effects and to dent the good reputation of the United States and some other states, and to burnish the reputation of governments that have handled the pandemic well. But I think the economic consequences are going to drive the geopolitical consequences, and that in general, those consequences will be good for free societies and therefore good for the West.
Thank you very much. This was Dr. Cory Reshape, Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you very much for your initial remarks. And the next one in the line is Professor Liu Chunrong. He is Executive Vice Director of the Food and European Center for China Studies, and probably he can address a couple of questions. Is China really bidding for its moment to replace the United States as the global leader and offer new alliances to the coming allies, among other aspects? So the floor is yours. Please unmute your microphone. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for having me in this wonderful program. I'm happy to speak to you from across the Baltic Sea, from Copenhagen. China-US relations in the changing global order is associated with COVID-19 is an enormous topic, and I think we continue to think this is the most important bilateral relationship in the 21st century. So what is going to happen in the next decades will really shape all our lives. So, and over the last few years, we have seen this precarious state of tension, and pandemic has obviously intensified the politicization of these relations. And there's a growing thinking to see this relationship as a kind of structural competition with very different quality in the past. So how China and US will interact in this context and beyond will really consequential. And whether this will lead to a collapse of rule-based order, or will it be appeared as a kind of fragmented regional order, or will it lead to a creation of a new multilateralism? It really depends. I think it depends on a lot of factors, a lot of variables. Let me highlight two variables I think which can play out in the future co-evolution. First is the domestic factors in both sides, China and the United States. And second is what I call the third-party variable, the socializing actors, in particular EU. EU can play a very important rebalancing role between China and the United States. So let's, domestic factors, both China and US has been a global actor. So critical issues of domestic politics certainly have the international implications. In the US side, we see Trump's foreign policy has a root cause in its domestic, like the shrinking of the middle class and kind of polarization, and also kind of a rise of identity politics, etc. And I think the new presidency may help to reconfigure this, but it's already a new reality. It's already a reality that has to be structural reality has to be dealt with. And for the Chinese side, I think we have to recognize that there's a very strong leadership, and that over the last years you see a very visible power recentralization. So and very strong political support and social support of the leadership, and this will give China very strong political capital and to project its role in both regionally and internationally. And previous speaker talk about emerging market, and I think after putting COVID-19 under control, China has been doing quite well in economic recovery. This sounds like good news to global economy. China still faces a lot of pressures to prevent a resurgence of the virus. But China has enormous homework to do. I mean, to deliver its promised socioeconomic aspirations, the so-called the two sentinel goals. So this year is the target year of eliminating an absolute poverty, which means China in total will lift more than 800 million people out of poverty. It's a huge policy target. And also top in the policy agenda, you find this, how to find a new pattern of growth, a new engine of growth, a quality growth, and also a green growth. And recently, you see there's a blueprint outlined for the 14th 5-year plan and the vision for 2035. So I think we have to be pay close attention to these domestic strategies and the concept of dual circulation, namely to use both domestic market and international markets. So China it's also rebalancing its developmental strategies. Overall, I think China, in dealing with the pandemic, it adopts a very broader perspective, and China is still preoccupied with domestic policy goals. It is the story of struggle for survival and struggle for recognition, and and this certainly invites more international cooperation rather than confrontation. So a few more words about relational perspective, and I think from the Chinese perspective, China-U.S. relationship must be framed in a broader social relations, and EU can play a very important role. And of course, we have to calculate other powers like Russia and also some regional actors like Japan in Asia Pacific. And from Chinese perspective, EU has a particular position and unique role to play because it upholds multilateralism, and also EU has adopted its strong attachment to solidarity. So but there is a kind of a trend of fortification. EU is growing sensitive to geopolitical thinking. So to what extent can EU use its strategic autonomy and rebalance U.S.-China relations? Is a question remains to be discussed. So to conclude a bit, I think there's a kind of multiple alternatives for this relations to take shape in the future. It really depends how these variables interplay in the context of pandemic. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Liu Chenrong, Executive Vice Director of the Food and European Center for China Studies. And I think it's like you provided some valuable comments and food for thought for the next speaker, especially those the leadership is enjoying the strong social political support of the local society. And what does it mean actually for the neighborhood, for the global order? If the rules-based order collapses, what's the alternative? Is it going to be the return of the jungle? To address these issues, I'm pleased to introduce retired Brigadier General Robert Spalding, who is now a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. I would like to remind that he used to hold a senior military position as a defense attaché in China, so he could probably share some of the insights, what is the present state of affairs, meaning for the United States, its partners, the present liberal global order, or the order China wants to offer to its neighbors in Indo-Pacific. The floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I think 2020 is going to be recognized as the year that the liberalism triumphed over liberalism. And it is really the power of globalization and the internet that has enabled this process. If we look at the rise of China in the context of merely economics, there's no doubt that they have done a great service to the people of China in raising so many out of poverty. At the same time, their integration into the international order has created, at least in the United States, widespread dislocation of employment, particularly around manufacturing. So there's been an economic pain felt by a good segment of the population in the United States. Over that same period of time, however, not only have we had this economic challenges, and it's not just to the United States, nearly every democracy that practices free trade principles has felt the power of the industrial policies and one-sided trade policies of the Chinese Communist Party. But also since the introduction of 4G networks and the smartphone, those platforms have transformed the economy away from industrialized economies to information economies. And today we deal with a world where Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, and Microsoft are 25% of the Standard & Poor's 500. And we have an information economy where their power is felt so strongly that Europe had to pass a law called Global Data Protection Regulation to prevent the widespread harvesting of data from their citizens and the use of that data in ways that are counter to European principles. So today we find ourselves in a world where data has risen to supreme levels in terms of a strategic resource because it feeds these widespread data harvesting systems that then transforms into machine learning and artificial intelligence usefulness in economics in the West. Now that has been translated into extreme wealth by tech companies in particular in the United States. But what we see as we transition away from the smartphone world and the world of 4G to the world of 5G and the smart city is the ability to collect information on everybody, regardless of whether they have a smartphone. And then to use the data thus collected to not only effectuate economic growth, but also to control social and political outcomes. This is what is happening currently in China. It was happening in 2017 when I was a defense attaché in Beijing. You could, at that time, order food on your phone and then put your phone away and walk into a restaurant where a camera greeted you, did facial recognition, and the server greeted you and handed your food. We're moving towards a world where the smartphone is no longer going to be relevant, but in reality, you're going to be tracked, and that tracking is going to enable you to interact with your surroundings. You'll be able to call for an Uber on a street corner without having to take out your phone because a camera powered by artificial intelligence will be able to recognize you and translate that into a virtual button push ordering your car. The only challenge here that we have, or the big challenge we have, is that data collected about you and harvested about you then can be translated into influence, not just in an economic sense to get you to be a better consumer, but also to begin to slowly change your social and political habits. This is what this is the purpose of the social credit score in China, to get you to behave in ways that the Chinese Communist Party wants. We are already seeing a convergence in these two systems in the West, powered by the large tech companies that I mentioned, in the East, powered by Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, the Chinese equivalent of these companies. And there's been a convergence on this idea of one narrative. And in fact, if you subscribe to that narrative, then you are allowed to be a participant. If you don't subscribe to the narrative, then you are essentially given a digital scarlet letter and shunned. This is a social credit score. This is also what's happening in the West, where these large tech companies have their own censorship programs. So we have a big challenge. The coronavirus really revealed the power of authoritarian regimes in our midst, and we have to recognize this power. It not only showed the nature of the Chinese Communist Party to enable air travel in Wuhan while restricting domestic air travel, international air travel, while restricting domestic air travel, thereby spreading this coronavirus all over the world. We have to deal with that issue. That's a physical issue, but we also have to deal with the digital Silk Road. We have to deal with the fact that Huawei has laid half the undersea cables today. We have to deal with the fact that in the West, we're lagging in telecommunications and computing technology, particularly as it pertains to the rollout of 5G. These are all things that are going to challenge our societies going forward in ways that are completely different from the 20th century. It is no longer about tanks and ships and bombs. It is about data, and it's about the use of that data to control societies. And this is what we face going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brigadier General Robert Spalding, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. I was just informed that Dr. Cory Shake has to leave for an important meeting. I have two questions already to the panelists, and I would like to melt them down into one to ask first to Cory before she leaves, and then these will be also some of the things that we could think about, for the future questions when we end with the comments. So first, when it comes to the global order, is it replaced, refined, or there is the creation of multiple regional orders built around the power centers by such revisionist powers as China, Russia, and Iran? And is it a competition for the global influence or already a warfare? So, Cory, the floor is yours. Before you leave, I would like you to hear from you about these questions.
First of all, let me apologize for being a bad circus act that I'm having to disrupt the panel by leaving early. I apologize, my friends. We messed up the scheduling. Second, I think the global order has always had...
Could you switch on your camera, please? I know it's early in the United States. Yeah, thank you.
So the first thing is, I think the global orders always had multiple regional power centers. Tom Wright argues in his recent book, All Measures Short of War, that the US order has always been a collection of regional orders. And I think that's right. I also don't think it's a particular cause for alarm, because if you look at the way that the West, and in particular the transatlantic relationship, has always worked, it's been the US dragging European allies to having a broader focus beyond Europe, and slowly, all of us realizing that we work together because we have common interests and we have common values that we're advancing. And I think you see that in the discussion about China now. The United States was much more hawkish on China than most European countries were. And you saw that reflected in the discussion about Huawei participating in 5G systems. And despite the reprehensible diplomacy of the Trump administration, you have seen Britain move towards the American position. You've seen Germany move towards the American position because the position itself has merit. And the concerns that the US raised, I think, reflect something that former Norwegian Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide said all the way back in 2005, which is China isn't just rising for the United States, it's also rising for Europe. And that is causing the transatlantic community to think much more carefully about how we want to handle a rising China. And I think the answer for all of us is that we continue to wish for a China that would be a responsible stakeholder in the international order, but that's evidently not what China wants for itself. And so we're having to figure out, where can we accept changes to the rules-based order that Europe and the United States created and want to preserve? And where do we need to try and contain China's more aggressive activities?
Thank you very much. And I just want to ask a little bit more, that Russia, China, like junior partners, it's like, how do you see those countries affecting, contributing to China or building their own different kind of political perspectives in the regions where they belong?
Well, I think Russia and China have a common approach to their regions, which is that both governments believe they have the right to determine the governance and the alliance relationships in their neighbors. And the US has been trying to persuade, not just the US, the NATO allies have been trying to persuade Russia since 1990 that it's in their interest to have stable, prosperous neighbors. And they should be celebrating the flourishing of the Baltic states, for example. And we have not been able to persuade Russia to adopt that frame of reference, and we haven't been able to persuade China to adopt that frame of reference. And so they do have certain common interests, which is they want to prevent people, whether in neighboring countries or in their own countries, from demanding representative governance. And we have an interest in free people being able to determine their own circumstances of governance. So it's an inherent contradiction. But I would defer to Nick Redman on what we should understand about Russia on this, because a lot of what I learn about it, I learn from him.
Thank you very much, Corey, and I wish you a very successful day. It's very early morning in the United States, so enjoy your breakfast and all the meetings. And
I'm so sorry to have to fire and forget.
No, don't worry about that. We will have a very interesting discussion, and thank you for being a part of it. So have a good day. I think there were a couple of interesting points. You know, it's like Russia enjoying the success of the Baltic states, not trying to undermine democracies, or actually seeing us as some kind of example. You know, it's like we would really love to see such approach in Kremlin, but it doesn't really work out the same way. And there were a couple of instances where European Union was mentioned as partner, balancing power, partner for the United States in the Transatlantic Alliance, and also the importance of Europe as a balancing power in those shifting times. Therefore, I would like to invite Dr. Patrick Keller, Vice President of the Federal Academy for Security Policy, to provide his views. How is it how the world is looking from the perspective of the European Union or Europe? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sanders, and thank you to all of the organizers for having me here today. It's really a great privilege, and I'm happy that the Riga conference can take place. My only regret really is that I cannot use this invitation as a pretext for an extended vacation in your city, maybe next year again. But I don't want to dodge your question, so maybe just 2 or 3 thoughts on what you were asking.
Sure.
I think the first point that I want to make is that the great power competition is really the defining strategic reality of our time. And I think this is by now well understood also in Europe. If you take the speeches of President von der Leyen or the recent speeches by the German defense minister and the recent Indo-Pacific guidelines of the German government, you can see that there is now a fundamental understanding that really what is going on between the US and China has major strategic implications for Europe as well. And if, in contrast to Corey, you want to say something sympathetic towards the Trump administration, you could give them credit for that, because in their strategy papers, national security strategy, various op-eds and so forth, the Trump administration had been very clear on that point, and I think that helped Europe to really grasp what was going on even before the Trump administration. So the great power competition really is the defining strategic reality of our time. And I think that leads to a second point, and that second point is that Europe is crucial in that competition and in that relationship. I recall a couple of years ago when I hosted a delegation from China led by a retired Chinese general. They were visiting Berlin and they talked to various decision makers, politicians and the like. And at the end of the whole tour, I asked the Chinese general, why are you doing that? Why are you spending so much time here in Berlin? And he leaned back and he smiled in this enigmatic way and he said, well, Patrick, when China goes to war with the US, when, not if, when China goes to war with the US, we want you to stay neutral. Now, it's more of an anecdote than anything else, but it helps me to grasp maybe what is underneath what we experience today in this relationship. And I think it is very clear that we as Europeans, we are not neutral, and we mustn't be. We mustn't be neutral if we want to preserve our open society and our way of life. And I think this must guide European policy to a much greater granularity on all across the board in very different fields of policy, in defense, in tech, in trade, in our approach to foreign investment, in our approach to development aid. We need to understand that there is an ideological conflict behind what we experience as this great power competition, and that in that conflict, we Europeans cannot and must not be neutral. There is no equidistance for us towards Washington and Beijing, but we know which side of the table we are on. Now, that leads to a final quick third point. If I put this in this stark neo-Cold War ideological terms, I am certain to scare most Europeans. Europeans don't want to hear that. In fact, if you parcel it like that, you are sure to get a new majority in Europe for, if you will, a kind of autonomy, sovereignty of Europe. Europeans don't want to be mixed up in that conflict between the US and China. They want to reap the benefits of both their relationships, both with the US and with China. They want to make it beneficial to have these relationships separately and at the same time. And I think that's also an almost wise desire to have it like that. But I think it can lead to a dangerous idea of autonomy in the sense that it means a kind of decoupling from the US and from the Transatlantic alliance. And this is why I think it is so important that we have a positive transatlantic agenda on this issue, not a negative one, not one of the harsh rhetoric of President Trump, but a positive agenda. And I think this is where the great opportunity now of a Biden administration lies for us as Europeans. It's really an opportunity to do something together, to build a future where China can be a part of what we want to achieve and our rules-based international order, and to make it an order that is acceptable to everyone. But in order to do that, we must first strengthen the transatlantic relationship. And I think it's very obvious what kind of topics we could address there. Since COVID is the theme of our panel here, I think that's the very first thing. We should have a working group on the transatlantic response towards COVID. It's a transnational threat. It needs transnational solutions. Why not get a vice president of the European Commission together with the Biden team and on a very high level organize a shared common response, or at least a fruitful exchange about best practice? Then we could, of course, do more in terms of trade agreements with like-minded partners across the globe to strengthen a kind of Western liberal idea of international cooperation, not nationalism and isolationism, but to have fair trade deals that include all those like-minded states. And of course, the same holds true for the core of the transatlantic relationship, for our alliance, for NATO. I think NATO could get much more active to revitalize the partnerships it has already established to like-minded nations in the Indo-Pacific, countries such as Japan, Australia, South Korea. I think on the security side of things, we could do much more and institutionalize much more. And I think it's also an opportunity that comes along with a Biden presidency to use NATO for that. But I think that's really the bottom line. We need to strengthen the West at home and abroad, because then we can have a prosperous China become a peaceful part of a more common future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patrick Keller, Vice President of the Federal Academy for Security Policy. I would like to invite a couple of comments, and the first one from Mika Aatola from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Mika, the floor is yours. How do you see the ideas? It's like all the comments in this discussion, it's like, how do they reflect, the topic of this panel and also the questions that we are trying to answer? The floor is yours.
Yes, well, thank you very much, and it's always a pleasure to be in Riga, virtually or physically. So thank you for inviting me to give some some insights and pose some questions. One thing that has been missing relatively from the discussion is the topic of the panel today, COVID-19. It is something, it is an entity. And if you look to the couple of millenniums of interactions between pandemics and people, between pandemics and politics, you perhaps should seek out certain patterns that might also be enlightening us today. William McNeill, when he wrote the famous book, 1975, Plagues and People, he described two patterns. There's the micro-parasitic relations, the disease agents spreading from one place to another. And then you have macro-parasitic relations, and those are relations of wars and conquest. And these usually go hand in hand. And that is something that perhaps we should also realize today, that in this relatively peaceful age that has prevailed since the end of the Cold War, there has been gradual emergence of international conflicts and tensions. And at the same time, we also we are facing consequences when it comes to bad governance of something that we were quite skillfully managing in the past, when there was great eradication programs going on by World Health Organization against quite a lot of different pestilences. So there is a collapse of governance, collapse of order, and that is something that COVID-19 is a portent. It is a signifier of, and we should be talking about that as well. What is the what is the effect of COVID-19? Well, those might be non-linear, those effects. They might be about the international atmosphere, about rising tensions and catalyzing decoupling, kind of intangible ideas what COVID-19 can actually make happen. Obviously, then you have good tangible examples like US elections that would have been very different if COVID-19 wouldn't have happened in the first place. So my basic suggestion for the panel discussion and the question is that what can be the effects of kind of the losing of the governance, declining of global governance, a regression of the ideals of post-Cold War years when liberalization, normalization of states, democratization of states happened. And now we can see the reverse of that, regressive forces taking place in the rule-based order. So where can you see the kind of the rise of new types of multilateralism and new types of governance that can perhaps after a while take place of these regressive forces, or at least balance the regressive forces of decoupling, kind of the building of the seams, heightening of the seams, and abuse of the seams, and also kind of a meddling in the affairs of other political systems. So clearly there is regressions happening, and we should pay attention to those. So I don't like to see the kind of the rehearsal of RECA 2019, RECA 2018, and now just loosely connecting it somehow to COVID-19. COVID-19 is a signifier of bad things to come if this regression of global governance happens. And the positive substance might be that there's new coalitions emerging, like the coalition between democracies, or then small democratic countries, mid-sized democratic countries who have managed to contain the disease, building up the trust levels, political trust levels inside the countries, and also respect and soft power when it comes to how they manage to handle things. In Taiwan, in South Korea, in Singapore, and also, well, in the Baltics and in Finland, that has the least fatalities when it comes to COVID-19 in Europe. So there are countries and pockets where a certain type of immunity has happened and trust levels are relatively high because of that. So can these countries set examples for other democracies to follow in this day and age where the great powers, China, is out of the game because there's a lot of doubts and mistrust towards China. because of what happened a year ago there. And then also for US, US failed in leading in the fight against the pandemic. It managed to do successfully against the Ebola epidemic in Western Africa 2015, as it has managed to do, for example, in the case of HIV/AIDS, the Bush administration's PEPFAR programs were very effective in Africa. So leaderless world when it comes to superpowers, and we are talking about major power conflict as being the defining thing. Whereas there are successful democracies that could actually bring about trust levels that are needed for setting models for new types of multilateral alliances, perhaps more inclusive ones than in the past. So basically, that's my input to this discussion.
Thank you very much. The pandemic has uncovered the intentions of major powers that are bringing the traditional ones together, that share common interests and values. As the next one, I also would like to invite one comment by Nicholas Redman, who is from Oxford Analytica. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And like some of my fellow panelists, it's nice to be in Riga, if only virtually, but physically would be so much better. Place I lived in the 1990s and greatly enjoyed. So I'd like to actually offer a slightly different perspective on things. I thought it was very interesting when my former colleague, Karishaki, talked about Chinese bullying, how many nodding heads I saw on my Zoom screen before me. Now that's entirely consistent with public opinion, elite opinion, that you see across much of the West in the last year or 2 years. Western Europe, Canada also, hugely turned against China in terms of opinion. But if you look at the rest of the world, actually that's not quite so much the case. There are many other countries where China is regarded much more positively. If we had a panel that had representatives from Brazil or Argentina, from Ghana maybe, or Nigeria, certainly South Africa, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, you would not see that nodding of heads. You would not see that recognition of Chinese behavior as bullying in this case. I think this is an important point for everyone in the West to get on the right page with, because it's not the case that everybody sees China the way that we do. Very interesting also, I think, how China has made great strides in international institutions. And let's take the one that you think in geographical terms they should have the least involvement with, the Inter-American Development Bank, focusing on development in South America and Central America. 2019, China was supposed to be hosting the annual meeting. That's China that has a smaller voting share in the IADB than Slovenia. And yet it wasn't Slovenia that was hosting the meeting. It wasn't going to happen in Ljubljana. It's going to happen in Chengdu. The extent to which China has built influence and friendships in international institutions and in developing countries around the world by dint of extensive trading relations and development aid is not to be underestimated. How you even begin to push back Chinese influence in international institutions that they have extensively staffed, because Western states largely gave up on them, some of these ones related to the to UN, but not directly under its umbrella. That's a really big question. How you fix that, I don't even begin to wonder. So China's offer to much of the rest of the world is a development aid offer in a way to distressed creditors that the standard international institutions often took a more skeptical view of whether they were a good credit risk. And it's very light on conditionality. If you're a president trying breakneck to develop your country, you're starved of infrastructure, you don't particularly want to submit to too many anti-money laundering or transparency measures, you don't want to bother about some of the niceties that Western agencies insist upon, the Chinese offer is a very, very persuasive offer. And this is why, as Cory alluded to, they're a massive creditor now, much bigger than the Paris Club in a continent such as Africa. Remember also that the Chinese offer is not like the American offer or the European offer, because it just doesn't have these conditionalities attached to it. China is not trying to export its value system. It's not trying to export its model. It's actually truly an exceptional country in the sense that it believes its own political system is the result of a unique culture and a unique historical experience that cannot be replicated elsewhere. So the deal with China is just that, a commercial deal. It's not after gathering allies. It's not after extending security blanket and guarantees. That's not part of its offer. But this is precisely why we have to understand the success it's had up to now, even allowing for the fact that, yes, there are a number of countries now that have quite large debts to China that they're going to struggle to pay. And the Chinese have an issue with what they are going to do with those countries as they hit debt distress. Thus far, it's been quite resistant to making any moves, any concessions, but tougher times for it lie ahead. I think we can't underestimate the damage that has been done to the reputation of Western countries more generally by what's happened in the United States and the United Kingdom in the past few years, and it's still going on. Whether the Republican Party can actually undergo the full Trump detoxification, I think is still an open question. Looking ahead, we're now facing the prospect of a separation in 5G telephony standards globally and a race. The United States decision to stop supplying semiconductor chips and barring them is forcing the Chinese to go down their own path. My concern here is that we will get to a situation where the Chinese might actually beat Western states. Firstly, we might have two different standards, or at least not fully common standards. But secondly, China had actually been in a position to win that race, to build out, as Major Spalding said, Mr. Spalding said, to win that race because it has already got a significant infrastructural advantage in that regard. So I think we're at a very difficult point. And I'd just like to offer the perspective on the panel that simply because we get on the page that China is a bad actor is not sufficient, because in the rest of the world, the Chinese offer is very strong. Western stock is nowhere near as high as perhaps we might think it is. The Chinese capabilities are significant, and it's a lot to play for. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, and I think it's like your final remarks are especially valuable. The Chinese technology, it is perceived differently in different parts of the world, like Africa, where they don't have much of the colonial past, the memory as they have with Europeans or other countries. And here's the first question, which is to Brigadier General Robert Spalding from Hudson Institute. So it's about surveillance capitalism and different rules of handling data and technology in the United States, China, and the European Union. It's like, are those regulations going to spark divergence in the European Transatlantic Alliance and China? Are those going to decide, what is going to be the cooperation in the future, since this technology is broadly used to undermine democracies and the trust in our governance, as Mika Atola mentioned before? The floor is yours.
Well, I think what I've come to the conclusion of is that laws aren't going to fix our challenge with regard to data security and privacy. It actually has to be built into the networks that we build, and if we don't focus on building secure, natively secure networks and communication systems, then we're going to continue to have these challenges of data harvesting and use in ways that are counter to individual citizen interests, and certainly because we are a representative democracy nation interests. And so I think this is the main challenge that we have, is to recognize that the internet was never designed in the beginning to promote the privacy or data security. And essentially, it has been decoupled from governance in terms of how it is deployed and designed and used. And I think there's been, widespread recognition of this, but governments to this point have allowed the commercial sector to drive the rise and spread of these technologies into our midst. Now they've overcome the ability of governments to actually provide the type of environment that would allow for people to not be influenced in ways that are counter to their own interests. And so it's time for governments to recognize. And if you look at just in particular the United States government, the people that are elected there, most of them have very little understanding of technology. I think something like less than 1% has ever, graduated with a computer science degree. The recognition that technology has overcome our ability to govern ourselves in ways that promote our interests is the key challenge that we face. And so really recognizing that technology and politics need to come together to solve in the technology the way that our data is secured, and to enable that continued interaction between and amongst democracies. I do think there needs to be a firewall between democracies and authoritarian regimes, because democracies tend to play by the rules and authoritarian regimes don't. And if we don't have a firewall between those two, then you're going to see overwhelming influence by the authoritarian regimes into democracies. But just amongst and between democracies themselves, we have to get the technology right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answer. The next question goes to Dr. Patrick Keller. And it went also to Dr. Kori Schake, but she has left. So Patrick, you will have to address this question alone. You spoke about values, natural alliances that bring the allies together, the positive rhetoric in the Transatlantic alliance. Like Russia seems to have a specific sphere of influence around its borders. How far do you think goes Chinese interest? What are the limits of its political interest, like building of the regional zone of influence? What would be the borders of this influence? Is it global, regional?
Well, I think it depends on how you define influence in that sense. When we look at the economic side of things and the use of technology and new digital technology in particular, I think what you can see and what we've been discussing here is that China's ambition and China's reach truly is global. It is well on track to become the most vibrant economy, the strongest economy on the planet, and you cannot build that without a global reach. And if you look at investment strategies, I think Nicholas' point is very good on what China is doing outside of, say, the Euro-Atlantic sphere, be it in Latin America, be it in Africa. I think that shows very clearly that China's ambitions are global, although, and I think that's also important to note, not in the sense of creating client states, but in terms of doing business in a way that is very favorable to China. But since China is governed in a way that is not liberal and not democratic, Robert Spalding spoke to that, and the social scoring system, I think we cannot treat it as a mere trading agenda and a mere trading partner. Because as you can see, with the influence China has gained in the European Union, for instance, in individual member states through its investments, you can see that it uses that for political leverage when it comes to political discussions, be it on the way it treats minorities or be it on larger strategic issues. So in that sense, I think we shouldn't underestimate Chinese ambitions. They are not limited to China itself or its immediate neighborhood. But maybe if I may, I would just respond to the comments being made by Mika and Nicholas very quickly. Can I, Sandis, or do you want to?
Yes.
I cannot hear.
1 minute. Up to 1 minute. Make it short, okay?
I'll make it very crisp.
Okay.
I think Mika is right on when he says that COVID is a signifier of bad things to come, in the sense that it is the first crisis of that kind in a very long time, international crisis, where the US did not take on a leadership role. But I would add, neither did China. I think China was badly hurt by the COVID crisis as well in its reputation and in its influence worldwide. So I think what we can see there is if the US is not leading, nobody else will, which just reinforces, I think, my point of creating a truly vital transatlantic relationship, starting with the COVID response, because then we can have then we can do some good on a broader international scale. And maybe just one sentence on Nicholas' point that yes, of course, China is offering a very competitive, very sweet deal to especially authoritarian governments in developing countries. Very much true. But I would still say we do not need to, just throw up our hands at that. Quite the contrary, we can be confident about what we offer, because what the Chinese offer is not a sustainable model. At the end of that model is a lot of debt, a lot of job insecurity for the people in the countries who, accept these apparently or superficially sweet deals. And it's not sustainable. It is not the way to go if you want to really, push your country forward in the long term. And I think this is something that we should make clearer, and where we should, face the competition more clearly. But yes, it's a jolt to us. The way we've been doing, say, development aid, we in the West, for decades, is obviously outdated and cannot compete with the Chinese offer.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for your final comments. And since the time is up, I have to conclude and wrap up this conversation. It seems to be very hard for China to embrace the liberal world order as it is, because, there are different kind of perspectives, values, regimes. And of course, China is looking from the communist interest and domestic interests of its Communist Party, and society seems to be supporting China's political standing. It seems to be that, there's a surging bout between democracies and autocracies, and technology, economy, and military power is upholding those international ambitions. China's offer is different from the one the Western countries, the Paris Club or World Bank and International Monetary Fund is extending to its partners, but it also comes with some kind of terms. Sooner or later you have to pay the debt back, and China is also not a philanthropic enterprise, and probably COVID-19 is just the beginning or the condition that is unveiling the challenges that we'll be facing in the future. I want to thank all the panelists. Thank you very much for being with me and us today. I wish we had a possibility to organize this panel here in Riga, but those are the conditions and we have to embrace them. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.